Professor Rita Kothari is the head of the Department of English and co-director of the Ashoka Centre for Translation at Ashoka University. She's a multilingual scholar and translator whose work spans across different disciplines such as literature, cultural studies, anthropology, sociology, and history. Her questions emerge from observations of regions and communities in the western part of the Indian subcontinent, Gujarat, Kutch, and Sindh. Her ethnographic research on marginal communities through religion, caste, occupation, and gender focuses on narratives of identity, raising questions of both linguistic and cultural translation. Professor Kothari has translated extensively from Gujarati and Sindhi into English and occasionally vice versa as well. Her translations as well as her edited volumes have made significant contributions to the field of language politics and translation. Movement across languages, contexts, and cultures forms the fulcrum of her interests, making translation the prism through which she sees the Indian subcontinent. Her latest book, Uneasy Translation, Self-Experience and Indian Literature, interweaves her personal journey as an academic into reflections around self, language, and translation, with an eye upon the intangibly available category of experience. I'll be handing it over to Professor Sumana Roy now. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Nidya. And thank you to all of you for joining us today. This conversation has been long overdue. It was started over WhatsApp, as most conversations do these days. And Rita and I have been looking for an opportunity to share what we usually do in private with all of you, hoping that you would be as interested in Rita as I always am. Rita, I'll begin with this Nietzschean idea of autobiography as philosophy. And I want to begin with the question that comes to me always when I look at people. What was your childhood like and how was it different from your siblings?
Yeah, I think the latter part of the question, how is it different from the siblings, was a very astute one. The first would have seemed to be like a kind of a narcissistic journey, and but let me focus on the second. So I was the fifth child in a home where everybody went to study in a Sindhi school. All those schools have shut down. All the Sindhi schools have pretty much shut down. My three sisters, my brother, we lived in a chawl at that time, a very, very low income housing, like one room sort of a thing. And I was born in that house, but I think my birth in some sense marked some kind of a shift in my family, that by that time they had aspiration to move to a more posh part of Ahmedabad and realize that this child should be sent to an English medium school. So I was the first one to go to an English medium school. So my sisters and all would study, the Sindhi alphabet, Alafambe, Be Balla, Te Bakri, whereas I was studying English. It sort of made me somewhat special in a home where nobody spoke English, but it also made me somewhat lonely. My universe was marked very differently from my siblings. And they would say to people who would come home, "Hey Rita, dadi suthi English galaindi hai, powerful English das." And but they didn't know exactly what I was studying. Nobody knew what exactly I was grappling with. They had no idea that there were so many other things happening in school that I didn't have the language to talk about. In Gujarat, Sindhis are seen as these dirty quasi-Muslim people. And I was shut in a bathroom one day for having raw onions in my lunchbox. And the Jain students sort of made a lot of comments, and they said, "She's stinking a lot." And I was shut in a bathroom. My family didn't know anything about this. These are not issues they were facing in their schools, right? Because they were all going to a Sindhi medium school. So I used to look at them of the fact that there was such a togetherness, that they would all take a bus and go to school, and whereas I was all alone, this very quiet child. But the fact that this marked actually a very different journey for me, in a way that it set me off on such a different path, is not something I knew at that time, obviously. So yeah, I think, but Sumana, those universes came to, they were very apart, but they also began to speak to each other a lot. Now I speak a lot to my sisters, and I think I've begun to appreciate admire the huge fortitude with which they go through life, and I look up to it. I think for a long time it was very separate.
Rita, do you remember the thing that you translated first and the impulse? I mean, no real recollection in that sense, but something that you remember translating at the very beginning, maybe as a child, and the impulse that made you want to translate this?
No, I don't have that recollection. All I know is that I was a student in Pune. I didn't want to go back to a very unhappy home. I could barely manage from month to month the fees that my father somehow managed to send me. So I knew I wasn't. So I mean, early on I became quite a hustler, and I gave an interview in Garware College in Pune. I gave the interview entirely in Marathi. I came back and I said to my friend Kamlakar, whom you know, right? And I said to Kamlakar that they asked me that will I teach in Marathi? I said, Kamlakar, I said yes, because I'll just do it. I'll just learn and I'll do it. And he said, Reeds, you are just so multilingual, and why don't you study translation? And I'm like, what is that? Like, does one study it? And it happened in my second year in Pune. And I thought, okay, this is something to think about. And no, so I have no recollection. All I knew is that Ganesh Devi was an important person for me. Like, he would understand. I went up to him, and he said he was on a fellowship in Leeds and so on. And he couldn't take me. He said, but as a PhD student, he said, but I see a lot of promise. Read these books, and then we will meet again. And he became, in some sense, a slightly remote sort of a mentor who very often he wasn't aware that he was mentoring me, but I was quite aware of it. Yeah.
Rita, one of the most interesting and significant things about your work as a translator and a cultural commentator for someone like me has been the informal nature of your archive and how it challenges the masculine idea of the archive. Would you share what made you want to think of this archive in this particular manner and when this started probably?
I don't know whether I thought of the archive as situated in a particular place. Speciality and archive never collapsed in my head as being in one place. But all I knew is that in navigating through life across different sections of society, a lot of Dalit writers, a lot of Muslim friends, a lot of Dalit Muslim students, it always seemed to me that I would come away somewhat unhinged by certain conversations. Like I would go home and tell myself, God, I didn't think about this. So I knew that my questions were not in the usual places. That what actually unhinged me seldom came from the usual places. It always came to me as small accidents, Sumana. I remember an instance when I was teaching in class Manto's story, Holdo, and in the course of teaching that class, there was another friend who came to attend that class, and she's a Sindhi Sikh, and I was talking about how that particular moment in Manto's Holdo when that doctor says Holdo, and she opens her nada, right? She opens her drawstring and so on. I always paused at that particular moment to see why was father feeling uncomfortable at that moment. and I've always thought there is something here about the sequence. Who's actually first saying it? The doctor saying it, and then do we see the father's reaction? And there was like a little sneaking suspicion I had that something is being said about the father also. But I wasn't completely sure. I brought it up in class, and around that same time, some of my queer students were organizing this, loitering, like why loiter outside and so on. And I came out of class, and this friend of mine, she said that I would wake up in the morning, Rita, and my pajamas would not be there. I knew that my father was visiting me at nights. She said, "Isliye ye sab jo hai na, this idea that let's go out, claim the city." She said, I understand that home is not a safe space for me. Outside is. But sometimes I came across situations where outside is not a safe space. Home is a safe space. So I think what these instances were doing for me is to not actually get wedded to forms of stability, and especially when they were related to caste and gender, was to constantly say, okay, I need to step back a little and I need to understand it, which is why my responses to many issues has become slower and slower over a period of time.
Yeah.
Because I feel like give me some time for a more quiet and a more deliberative occasion to kind of see how do I want to think about it, because I feel like I think we just kind of immediately rush to claim something, but I also feel like if we arrive at it somewhat slowly, then we might be able to see that there are many other nuances and there are many other people who come with a slightly different story. So I think over a period of time, I find myself less and less willing to actually say something in this, like dhadak karke, I find myself wanting to sort of say that, okay, let me qualify here and let me just see what is going on. So I think a lot of occasions, because I was meeting Sumana people from so many different sections of society. I came from a particular class which is not associated with academia at all. And then I was teaching in places where there were students coming from all kinds of quarters of society. But then I was also very early on giving keynote addresses, traveling to different parts of the world and so on. And so therefore there was also this notion that people didn't quite know how to peg me. I wasn't legible by all academic standards. It was almost like in Bellagio, for instance, when I was on a Rockefeller Fellow, someone from Columbia, he said, "Who are you? Like, what did you come out of? Like there are no usual trajectories that can tell us how someone like you is produced." And I'm not making out a case to be saying that I was this most underprivileged person. There are many more who are, which is why I think all the efforts for us to become a more inclusive institutions are very worthy. But I think what perhaps happened is that there was a kind of an anomaly in where I came from and where I was, the questions that I was asking. And even today I feel like there is a certain degree of illegibility. Maybe there isn't illegitimacy. I don't know.
What a wonderful response. Let me take a little further into your archive and what, as I said, the informal nature of it. You remember when I was reading the first or second draft of Uneasy Translations that you were sharing with me, chapter-wise. My favorite section was about the mother's notebook, and the fact that someone, as a translator again, but also as a cultural commentator, wants to turn to these informal spaces of the woman's notebook, not just the diary, the literary diary, for instance. Would you share this, what you found in the notebook, and you remember what I loved about it so much, and how you responded to it?
So the notebook about her did not exist.
I know, but she was meant
What happens is that all the women in my family, and that also includes me in my younger days, when I had a lot of existential angst, that we all went to satsang. right? And I think it was very helpful for us at that time. I also found it very helpful when I was 17, 18 something, and they thought I was going to be like this major spiritual leader, and until I told them I like men too much and I'm not actually, I don't think that this is the life that I want to sign up for. But so my sisters, my mother, they all go to satsang, and the incident that Sumana is relating to in uneasy translation is when during COVID there was a lot of work, right, at people's homes and so on, and my family has not had, they've had people coming and cleaning, but they've not had anybody to cook or anything, and there was constantly a lot of work, and yet my mother would feel weird that she's not going to satsang, she's not going anywhere, and she would call me up and she would say, Rita, cha kya samjh mein natho ache. So then I said, Mummy, kuch likho, penje bare mein likho. So she said, what will I? She studied up to 3rd standard in Ajmer, and she writes Sindhi in the Devanagari script. She writes what she listens to in the satsang. So she would write like, कि भगवान ऐसे कहता है, अहंकार छोड़ो, things like that. She would write in Devanagari Sindhi. So I said, Mummy, write something, whatever it is about yourself. And then she said, 2 days later, she called up and she said, no, Baban, mata nathi likhi saka. And so I said, cha thyo? And she said, Ma likha bhai Rita, atam katha bhai likha, Hinanji and Minji atam katha bhai likha. Hinanji is unki, as in my father. And she said, Hinanji and Minji atam katha bhai likha. This idea for her that autobiography is that of her husband's and hers, not hers alone. And she said, and then I abandoned, right, because I thought, you will feel bad about your father, that I don't want to say certain things. So I said, Mommy, don't worry about it. I will remember my father in the way I want to remember. You write. So she said, no, ma satsanga ji mani likhandas. What I used to. And that particular moment actually made me think so much about how that particular Vani of the satsang, where you hear, you are told, even when you are a woman, you are told, just own up to yourself, right? That tum ghar ki naukrani nahi ho, tum bhi ek atma ho, tumhari bhi ek izzat hai, aur tum kaho. And there is a kind of feminism of the satsang which has not been documented at all. I mean, I loved in that description you put, Sumana, about things which are outside documentation. There is a feminism of the spiritual realm which is of a different kind altogether, and we've not had the time to understand it. I think my sisters and my mother began to really sort of own up to a stronger sense of self out of that space. So she would write down those things, but when I told her that, you write down this, the word autobiographies didn't even come into play. And she said, na ma satsanga ji mani likhadas, ma unajhe lai theek hai, wohi mere liye theek hai. The fact that the particularity of her life seemed so scary to her, and whereas in some sense the universality of the satsang ji mani seemed to her to draw her attention, it looked to me as if that is what a lot of us do. I think sometimes we take refuge in theory because we also want to escape the particularity of our experience, and we want to escape the burden, the chance, the opportunity, the need to theorize from our particularities. Really speaking, what to do with our particularities is a very challenging business, because you also cannot become very sort of self-absorbed and narcissistic, but you also need to know who you are and why you respond to something the way you do. I mean, we are not some disembodied people who have just landed in this space. We come with our histories. So I felt like something in the way my mother took flight to that notebook was a flight that I see very often people take in different contexts to something they think is safer and which is more sanitized.
Again, what a wonderful response to something that I was hoping you would say it in a very Rita Kothari way, which is this this idea that we call academics, for instance, when you go to art school, I haven't been to art school, but the fact that you spend the first few years just copying the quote unquote the masters, and it's significant. We have an art historian there, Janice. The fact that it is called an academic style, it could be a compliment, right? That, you know, it's not coming from who one is, and the fact that we gravitate towards who we eventually become, eventually the theories that we inhabit or create. In this context, Rita, one of the titles of one of your essays has the phrase field notes in it. And again, I think you're challenging the idea of an archive in these field notes. Would you share what you meant with our students, please?
So, when we do ethnography, obviously we come back to wherever we are staying and we make notes in a diary. But when, for years later or for months to come, something in that ethnographic experience lingers. And I think the lingering has become a very meaningful place for me. When it lingers and I think in some sense the note-taking has continued, right? I said earlier that for me, the questions are not always collapsing with speciality. But that being said, there was something to that particular project, Memories and Movements, Borders and Communities in Kutch. And that essay actually came out of a strange sort of it's a small region. Go there someday. It's called Bani. It is a place where the Ranotsav happens, where the desert festival takes place. It became a very big thing after Modi became the chief minister, because it was this became this exotic place where Amitabh Bachchan would walk on the desert and say, Kuch din to guzariye Gujarat mein. Except that this was not quite Gujarat. Technically it was, but it was very much like Sindh. यहाँ पे सिंधी मुसलमान रहते हैं, all readers. And their sense of origin, their genealogy, their songs, their Sufi verses, everything is across the border. This is a region where Pakistan radio plays all the time. This is a region where there are constant phone calls, but there is also a border security force, so people don't say it. But unofficially, there is a very simmering border that is in people's homes. It's a very fascinating region. And I was staying there, working there. I did this ethnography for almost 6-7 years. And I would go to people's homes. They would be made in the form of a bunga. A bunga is like, if you see a photograph, it is like this conical shaped mud house. और उसके घर के ऊपर there would be like, you know, these लकड़े की सलाखें होती थी, which were lacquered with beautiful colors. And it is a particular community you find in Pakistan and in Kutch that does this lacquer work. You will only find those people sometimes in Delhi Haat. And they are called Vada, as in carpenters in the Sindhi language. So I would go to people's homes, by which I mean the Dalit community of that region, which are the Meghwals, or I would go to that of the Sindhi pastoralists in the region, and I would see these lakde ki salakhein, which are lacquered, and I would say that, you know, this is so beautiful, who makes this? And they would say, ye Vardhan thai man, ye Vardho ne banai. So I'm like, kaun hai wo log? I said, Vardha kirti then, who are? So they said, "Arey, kuch nahi, jangli maru and you know they are like savages." So I said, "But what?" I said, "Where do they live?" So they said, "You'll find them anywhere. Kahin bhi ghar bana lete hain." And I couldn't understand what to do with these questions. Then I'm asking, but I could ask them. But in my head, I'm thinking, you know, but I need to find out: are they SC? Are they ST? And then I did not have answers to this question. And then I asked myself, why am I asking this question? I both needed to know, but I was also watching myself needing to know. And I was confused what was going on. I think there is a certain semiotics, but of course, which I know. And I did come to know. But the point was that it made me ask this question, whether ethnographers are translators, which they are because we represent the reality. It is also to say the ethnographer looks for equivalences. Like even I needed equivalences of the categories that I was, where I could fit them in, where I could make sense of it. And I think this is where it gets a little contentious, Sumana. This particular essay actually goes on to show, for WADA themselves, they are, in the Anthropological Survey of India, they are listed as Koli tribes, WADA Koli, which in some places is part of tribe, in some places it's part of OBC, depending on whether it is Kutch, Saurashtra, Rajasthan or Sindh, right? But this is the interesting part, that they take lac out of trees and they make this color out of it. And their food habits include eating whatever they can find amongst the trees, right? Which is also why they are seen the way that they are seen. Now I began to actually then visit WADA homes and so forth, and you would have one person in the family who would be called Bodabai, you would have another person in the family who would be called Noor Jahan or something. Salman, ऐसे फिल्मी नाम थे. So I said to one of the WADA family, I said, यार कदी तांजा नाला बुता बयन कदी ता नूर जायो. And look at our, I think this is where, when I'm saying we, as in people like us who are educated, I mean, our questions are just sometimes so dodgy, right? So I'm not saying, who are you, tell me, but I do want to know. So I said, Kadi ta hi aayo, kadi ta hu aayo. And then they said, one of them said, हाँ माँ, मुझे बा मुसलमान थी हो, but I did not. But then sometimes he comes back, and sometimes we do Eid, but sometimes we do Diwali and so on. He said, but people like you, educated people like you, have always said कि तुमको एक तरफा होना चाहिए. And we are so juggly that we have not learned how to become ek tarfa and proper like you. And I found it heartbreaking. And I came back and I kind of basically then I thought that, all the homie baba hybridity we celebrate, look what it does to people on the ground. That they are not owned by the Musalman Jamaat because they are not fully Muslim. They are not owned fully by the Hindu because they are not Hindu. Sometimes they keep going back. They are also very clever people. So they will tell the VHP, हाँ मंदिर बना के दो and we will become Hindu. And then the mandir is made, they don't know how to pray. They were like, those poor fellows were telling us how to pray, but we can't learn. Yeah. We find it difficult to learn. So we just went back to being who we are. So but their vulnerability is actually increased multifold by the fact that there is no one sabha or jamaat that can say to them that we will give you help here. And so their hybridity has actually made them in some sense more vulnerable, right? Now if I were to say therefore they should become proper Hindus or proper Muslims, can you see how contentious it is? And how that will go down when we are celebrating hyphenated identities. So I needed to tread this carefully, but basically this is what I felt was happening here, that there are forms of impurity that are not nice to live with. And there are forms of impurity that you can make much about and you can celebrate, but I think it's really a matter of some context and capital. Not all forms of quote-unquote impurity are counter-hegemonic.
Some impurities are more equal and unequal than others. Yeah. Rita, you mentioned the border a few times. I've been fascinated reading about this region, Bandi, particularly the way you write about the changing plant life in the region and how that moved you as a translator. Maybe I'll keep this for the end if we have time, but I want to know from you, as someone who's worked in this border region, what is the border, Rita?
Yeah, I think that question, what is a border, is a very central question. It's not, I think the intensities in that region about where women could go and not go, the intensities around who is a proper Muslim, whether somebody is the way the Sufi type Sunni Muslim that he used to be, or whether he needs to become the LA Hadith kind of Muslim, the Meghwals of that place who needed to become proper Hindus, the fact that my Sindhi sometimes had a border with their Kutchi, the fact that there was across the border the region of Tharpakar and Badin where they had some of their relatives, and before the international boundary was promulgated, both cattle and humans used to go back and forth. So I think the intensities of many borders came through in that region. But I think I will only say this to kind of just simplify, not simplify, but one thing I'm quite clear that borders need words, that we need to have an ammunition or artillery of words to form borders. And languages are also, they are formed through those borders, right? And sometimes they are marked territorially, and sometimes territories need a language, and sometimes languages need a territory, right? My own language, Sindhi, does not have a territory, right? It is one of the very few languages in India, interestingly, like English, that it does not have a territory. English's deterritorialization makes it, if you like, cosmopolitan. Some people even use the word neutral. Whereas Sindhi's deterritorialization has rendered us in a place that I'm right now translating a Sindhi novel of the first woman writer ever from that region who does not figure in any women's literary history. And she writes a novel about a Hindu-Muslim romance at the peak of partition. And there was a lot of controversy around it, but nobody has read it, nobody has heard of her, nobody has written about it. Her son, who's now in his 70s, saying that, Rita, once you finish translating, I will read what my mother wrote, because he neither speaks Sindhi nor does he read it, right? So I think the borders have been a very, very sort of alive category for me, but I think borders are formed through words. So if you say, this person cannot come into my class, this is a prerequisite, we need language for all of that. Or you say, you can only do this particular assignment or post in this manner. I think all of that requires words, and sometimes there is no difference between the way elites choose a vocabulary like a border security force. It's like a BSF by which you kind of determine who can come to your class, who can't, who can be a good student, who can't, who is using the right vocabulary, who's can't, who's not. I think there are a lot of border making practices around us, but we also know that there's a lot of unbordering that we constantly yearn to do, and sometimes we do it. So this forming and unforming, I think, characterizes life.
Two thoughts that come to you from your really wonderful responses. The two of us taking a walk, you asking me, I'm going to go for a smoke, will you come even though you don't smoke? And yes, we're walking.
I must have asked everybody in this room.
and we're discussing something, and suddenly I think I characterized someone, one of our colleagues, who obviously will not be named as, but don't you think they are intelligent, Rita? And Rita suddenly stops and says, what you are characterizing as intelligence is only some kind of skill, right? And I remember that because it helped me to think about academia, what you're saying right now about language and border making and border enforcement in so many different ways. It also, because of my interest in plant life, makes me think, is it because plants don't have words that they don't know borders? But I'll return to the wonderful things in your essays. I would like you, I know you've forgotten your reading glasses today, but if you just read that first paragraph from, it's called Elsewhere, Language, Gender, Translation. And I think many of you have read it already. This first
From the
paragraph.
start or here? on the face of it, what can gender and translation have in common? Nothing really. The former is about everything, and the latter, a mere linguistic activity of transferring one set of things from one language into another. As some people remind us, translation is as secondary as the woman herself. What does it take to transfer meanings? It's a quiet in-house activity that makes some people happy and brings them a little something, joy, money, whatever. It's a hobby, not a real job. The real thing is the quote-unquote original. Translation is a mere copy of that, a parasite that depends on it. These reductive and much repeated views don't help us open any questions. In fact, they close them, and merely contesting them does not help. The hegemonic symmetry is too neat and sterile. It is non-generative by restricting itself to binaries of men and women and their respective forms of labor. I'm hoping that in this thinking aloud essay, we go beyond this impasse, this stasis.
What an extraordinary, I think, Rita, you shared a part of this essay on Facebook a few days ago. And what an extraordinary woman translation conceit that drives this essay. I want to ask you about how this conceit came to you, how it triggered you into writing this really wonderful essay, and also take this opportunity to ask you why the uneasy in uneasy translations.
This particular essay actually began independently first as a book that I thought I would do for Urvashi Bhutalia in Zuban, where she said, Rita, please write a short book for us on translation. And I had done a book called Speech and Silence, Literary Journeys by Gujarati Women for Zuban earlier. And then I've also translated Joseph Makwan, K.M. Munshi, and so forth. And I always felt that all the discourse around feminism and translation was actually so much about the agency. It was about the bodies that we read as men and women. But I kind of always felt that actually the genderedness is not produced quite in the fact that here is a woman translator translating a male work of art or whatever, that it is actually produced elsewhere. But what is that elsewhere? And I feel like it is I think gender observations around gender to me have always caught me by surprise for some reason. It's like they hit me because they come to me like grief, like when you don't expect it. They seem to be not there when you think they are. And I'm not sure why that happens, because I feel like in the standard places where you think it would happen, that is not where it happens. And then every now and then from some lateral view. So for instance, when I was translating women's writing from Gujarat, I was this like exacting, if you like, editor, compiler who's like going through tremendous amount of writing, and I'm thinking like, to hell with you. What are you even writing about? Like there's so much happening in this state, but you don't want to say any of that. You just want to remain this very bodro, because the upper caste Gujarati literature people is very, very sort of bodro. And I'm like thinking, it's not a project that did anything for me in some sense. It made me observe a few things, and I came away realizing questions of caste respectability, a certain genteelness that marks that kind of writing. So that observation was an important one. But actually when I was translating, then I translated Joseph Makwan's Angariya, the Dalit, which is really arguably the first Dalit novel in the country. I translated that. Joseph Bhai was very fond of me. We used to visit each other and so on. And one day he got a visitor who was like the son of Shami Kapoor, the actor, and who had read this novel and who said he wanted to make a film out of it. and then Aditya Kapoor. And then he comes to me and he says, take me to Joseph Bai's place and so on. And I go there and the two of them are like, they hug each other, aap to bilkul saras sakshat saraswati ho, and so on and so forth. And he says, I want to make a film, and Joseph Bai is like, yes, of course you should make a film. And and he says, how should we sign a contract? But so I said, the copyright of this OUP, because the English translation. So Joseph Bai says, Rita, then, forget about that English translation. This is between us. It is like, in the sense, like Aditya Kapoor would have read the Gujarati novel, if you like, right? And I sat there somewhat bemused that I was reading Lawrence Venuti's book on the translator's invisibility, and I was sitting there and thinking, "Acha, aise hota hai." Like I can actually feel it. And I was like, I had actually aspirations that they would give me some hefty commission, but nothing doing. They just behaved like they were two men who were on their own trip and whatever. I didn't think at that time of my being a woman or anything like that. It's only much later then I thought, would they have done that to a male translator? What happened in that particular moment? But even this, I sort of moved on. Then when I translated K.M. Munshi, who's like a big figure in Gujarat and so on, so many people would say that Rita ben bahut saras kaam kari, Rita ben bahut, tame bahut service kari. And I'm like, I didn't cook for Munshi. Like this. And I realized that all this work that I had done, that you don't want to say, but I translate Munshi that you want to. So, this is the elsewhere. That sometimes it is actually, these conversations fall outside the text. They are not always in the text. They are happening somewhere else. In the way sometimes you're introduced, in the way sometimes you're referred to. It can happen so I feel like this is one thing. Another, the elsewhere-ness, Sumana, was also this, that we navigate so many multilingual spaces, even in our domestic place. But we don't think of the domestic as a site of language politics, right? I mean, some of us do, but we don't. So, forever, when I would make what is called koki, my mother-in-law would say, "Ha beta te kanda na thepla karya," that is how, what I was doing as a translator ethnographer in the field is what she was doing. She was coming up with her own category to, in some sense, read into my Sindhi cuisine words that are comfortable to her. And so I began to kind of think that the domestic actually produces such interesting generative politics and questions of language and translation. So that is also my elsewhere, right? So my elsewhere is not necessarily the text, but sometimes it may be the text, but then not actually the main body of the text, but somewhere in and around and so on. And I think the idea of elsewhere has actually stayed with me a lot. We always think of happiness lying elsewhere, I think, and we think it's meant, whether that is a space, a person, a moment, a history, we don't know, but it sort of beckons you. And sometimes you realize that there is none. And it can be a good thing too. Like I think I'm certainly at a stage, because I'm also a certain age and all of that I feel there's no elsewhere. That in some sense that it is now, it is this moment. Whether I succeed in it every day or not is a different question. But it is like Mr. Musical says, I have made my commitments now. This is one. As others choose to give themselves to some remote and backward place, my backward place is where I am. And this idea, therefore, that there is no elsewhere. But I think even as I think of that question, Sumana, I'm also interested in the question of home, right? Whether home, that elsewhere is actually the home, and whether you need to go somewhere to return to that home. And I want to give just two quick examples through two women that I'm very interested in the current work that I'm doing, where I'm translating the Sufi poet Shah Abdul Latif from the 17th century. I'm translating him into Hindi. And there is one story of Sasui and Punu, which is a very well-known love story in northern India and so on, where Punu, who's a Baluchi Jat, and Punu is abducted at night by his father, saying how can he marry this girl and so on. Sasui goes looking for him. And Shah Abdul Latif's entire, if you like, the Sufi yearning is about Sasui looking for her lost man. And she goes through mountains and she goes through deserts and she goes through very difficult paths only to realize that Punu kandi kandi, Punu to muh mein hai, Punu to mere andar hai, right? But sometimes you need to go that much elsewhere to be able to return home. Another story that I, again from Shah Abdul Latif that I work with, is a story of Umar Marwi. And Marwi belongs to a nomadic community. She has been abducted by a king who's giving her all the best things in the world. But she says, I want to go back to the humble origins that I come from. I don't want anything that you give me. And she keeps saying about wanting to go to the people of Maru, who are modest people. We wore torn shawls, but that is where I want to go. And that is where I'm from, and none of this matters to me. So this idea of do we go somewhere or do we remember who we are is a very important question for me, Sumana. It's very important for me to think whether that elsewhere is a space, and also the memory of who we are, I think is also important. If you are at a place where that elsewhere, the fact that you came from elsewhere, which filled you with shame, if you are able to make peace with that, then I think you want to be like Marui, to say, this is who I am. I came in this clothing and I'm comfortable in that clothing. Or you could be like Sasui and say, I need to go through that much to be able to then realize that it is within me. So I think both the hearkening and returning have become very important, shall I say, academic or spiritual preoccupations with me.
Really wonderful response again. I have many other questions, but will now let all of you take the advantage of speaking to Rita directly. Rita, yes.
Thank you, Professor, for the wonderful conversation. I mean, of course, it was brilliant, and I mean, I would like to start with a comment, perhaps. And I really like the way you charted, albeit briefly, your foray into academia as a first-generation learner, perhaps, that how there is this question of illegitimacy, and people would be having trouble to pinpoint what your cultural capital was, whether you had a kind of lineage. And I really felt like appreciated, and like, I mean, seeing you carve a niche into academia just makes us similar backgrounds feel visible and like appreciated. And with that, I will ask a question on the second piece that we talked about elsewhere. I have a question about the story Nana Rasik Bhai Mehta, translator. In your translation, you have chosen to keep some words transliterated very particularly. The excerpt that you mentioned here, that between the conversation between Nana and the police inspector. And you also mentioned that what makes Nana so illegible to the language of law. And I was wondering about what was the process of translating the story, if you could comment on that perhaps. That was there any kind of linguistic conflict so that you chose to written by transliterating certain words, something like that.
Right. So just to provide a quick context of the story that Devadrita is mentioning is a story from this book I've done called Greatest Gujarati Stories Ever Told. Terrible title. But so there is this woman from, as they say, good family, right? Matlab khandani type ladki. She goes to a police station and she's like saying, I want to write a complaint, but she's not using the English word that it is a complaint about domestic violence. Once she says it, it's like something changes in the room. Once she spells it out. Up until then, all the homilies that the cops are using to her and between each other, so to her in Gujarati, with each other in Marathi, I think those homilies are very important for me, Devadrita, right? The fact that they say, Ale asa hota, why are you like worrying so much, and kita chan ghar hai tumcha, and tumhi complain karte, लाइक बर्तन तो एक दूसरे से लगेंगे ही, आवाज तो होगी ही, कभी कभी होता है, कभी थोड़ा गुस्सा आ जाता है, क्यों ऐसे, लाइक यू नो व्हाई दिस इज अ सी फेसिंग हाउस एंड सो ऑन. सो फॉर मी द होमलीज by which this entire thing was dealt with, almost to say हम आपस में समझ लेंगे, right? Until she says ना पण no, say it is domestic violence. Once she uses those English words, it's almost like that friendliness, that homeliness has completely gone. And they exchange a look and with each other and they say लिखा तुम्ही domestic violence का case आहे. And then they do that. I found, so no, there was no conflict. But I think for me, that exchange was an important one. Between them in Marathi, because the story is based in Bombay and regions matter a lot to
Exactly.
me. Right? So that's in Bombay, they are, and then also to her in Gujarati, and the fact that she uses English at that time. So I think some of my translations are actually examples of non-translation.
Exactly. Thank you, Professor.
English and then
I wanted to ask about something that you mentioned in different responses or sort of suggested, and that is about thinking out loud. I think I want to know how it is possible to do that in public. How you have the, to use another word that you use but in relation to your siblings, the fortitude to be in a classroom space or in a public forum where you're being asked to speak and you're not afraid to think at that moment, and even if at a moment say something and then immediately correct yourself and say no, I actually don't think that's how it goes. And there's some parallel to that with your collaborations. If we look at your bibliography, there's so much work that is collaborations with other people to produce knowledge in conversation, in dialogue, in asides. What are these modes of production of knowledge, and how is it that, given the institutionalized forms in which knowledge is produced, that we take conviction in these elsewhere?
Wow. Yeah, I mean, sometimes I say it's great teaching at Ashoka, but I'm not sure you have to be this bright. I think, Vignesh, the thinking aloud wasn't always there. It has become more so now, because I think I'm actually less afraid now of being corrected. But I will not write till I've done my due diligence. But while I'm speaking, I'm okay actually to be told in class that not sure this is working, or to come back the next time and say, well, I actually thought about what you said. Which is not to say that some jab doesn't happen. Of course it happens. It may well happen even here. But I feel like that muscle, I think just as we develop muscles of the body, I think the muscle of criticism, which does not shake you, which does not make you angry, which does not sort of destabilizes you, is an important one. Because if I will not claim to be perfect, but I can at least be honest. And I think in an imperfect world, honesty is fine. We can live with that much. But I can't say that I could have managed it in my younger days, Vignesh. Perhaps it is difficult in the younger days. You do need to sound like you have some certitudes in place. And I also think the economy of academia produces us as these confident people, right? Fortunately or unfortunately, I escaped your kind of education. Right? And So I wasn't socialized into it. I was pretty much following my own path. I was doing a PhD without coursework. I was teaching in a college, raising a child, cooking at home, doing a PhD. Nobody told me this is how research methodology is done. I taught myself to do it. So really speaking, I think some of it is also coming from being an autodidact. And it's also coming from the fact that I am at my age now. I think I'm okay to be say I'm unsure about this. I'm working on it. Yeah, I think so. I don't know if that answers your question.
Thank you so much for your talk, Professor. You spoke of your mother's experiences that remain outside documentation, right? And how you told her tum kaho. But what happens when the kehna might have consequences? And to make it more specific, my question was about lived experiences that get invisibilized to say lower caste individuals and people from other marginalized communities in a space like Ashoka. And how to get past, say, any impediments that might arise when you try to speak of these experiences. For more context, say the protests that have been happening outside the gate. I have talked to people from lower caste backgrounds who were really afraid to come out and protest and speak of their experiences. And especially when they are overwhelmingly in a minority, right?
Yeah.
And the response has also been less than ideal. If I'm not wrong, you and a few other professors removed their signatures from, say, the caste census petition because they didn't agree with how the protests were being conducted, even though most of it was all of it, in fact, was peaceful and democratic forms of dissent. So, when there is such a response, even from professors whose pedagogy might be around caste, how does one go about documenting and speaking of their experiences in an environment that would do anything to shut down these voices? How do you navigate that space?
Yeah, no, in fact, that particular moment actually when Argo Bhattacharya sent that email, and for previous 3 days, another friend, colleague of mine, who was not mentioning the protest at all, but who was actually thinking of moving out of the campus because there is constantly so much noise, that I just felt like there was something here that perhaps we needed to be mindful of, that these are people's homes, there are old people and there are children. So it was really not about the protest at all, it was really about the faculty housing and so forth. But that being said, I completely take on board what you are saying about the vulnerability around those who can, I kind of completely understand that. And at no point do I want to say that those students do need to come out. I think what I would have been, which I said at the beginning of this interaction, a process where we could have dialogue, right? Where somebody would say that, Professor Kothari, I did not like this. Can I come and see you and can we talk about this? Or that this is what we plan to do. And since you talk about these things in your pedagogy, can we sort of share this with you? I'm not saying that you have to take my permission, but I think sometimes not to be actually part of something around a question of inequality and lack of resources, which one has felt so strongly and observed and written about and noticed in other people, and has made sure that in pedagogy that does not happen. I think one would expect that at least some trust, some conversation comes to us before you're asked to sign a petition. And I think there was also that. But that being said, from the last I checked, my name was there and I didn't pursue to say remove it or not. I'm actually quite happy to reinstate it, but I will also document what I felt, what I just told you.
Thank you so much.
First of all, thank you so much for your very exciting ethnographies and anecdotes, Professor. I'm very interested in something that you said, when we're thinking about safe space, it is neither in the city nor in the home. When we are thinking about a definable identity, it is neither defined by border as your ethnography in Bani Shore, because as Muslim Sunnis are culturally Pakistani, so to speak, even if they are within the border. And so I'm just wondering, this conversation around elsewhere, right? Where do we look if the safety is not in the space, identity is not in the border, not in the religion? So then is elsewhere a question that we need to keep looking for, or is it an answer to these questions itself?
Yeah. I mean, it's not meant to be a neti kind of a situation. It's not meant to say it's not here, it's not here, it's not here. It is really meant to say that there are no rehearsals. Like, I think rehearsed positions put me off a little bit. Like rehearsed notions of this is safe space. I mean, I think compare the two examples that you are mentioning here. If this is a safe space for a certain kind of sexual identification, it is not a safe space for a certain kind of caste identification. So then, how should we think of Ashoka inherently? Is safety its inherent aspect? It is and it is not. It depends on who's asking that question, right? It's a bit like Toni Morrison saying invisible to whom? When you are saying invisible, we have to ask invisible to whom? So that's all. So it's not to say, Rohit, that we have to keep looking for elsewhere. I think it is only to say that all of it is contextual. Really speaking, depends on who's seeking what out of it. But at no point, I think, should we lose sight of the material conditions that make something work for some people and does not make something work for some other people. And I feel like intellectual resources and material conditions are not that separate from each other.
Any other questions? Yes, please go ahead.
So, Professor, in the legend of Shah Bidai, when he meets the Nathpanthi sadhu in the desert, and then the sadhu asks, recites the penultimate lines of the legend, and then Shah Bidai says the last line, and then he dies. So, do you think for the Nathpanthi sadhu, then Shah Bidai becomes the elsewhere that he was in the search of, and that feeling that when Punhu is with you, situating Punhu within the sadhu was maybe the magic Shah Bidai did, and that magic is in becoming the elsewhere.
Yeah, I think I'd be in a better position to answer this question maybe 2 years later, because I feel like my study of Shah Abdul Latif is not fully complete. I feel like in every dastan in Shah Abdul Latif, whether it is Mumal Rano or the one about Nath Yogi, in each I think there is something else that is going on, right? And so I don't want to provide already a certain totalizing sort of a conclusion to that project. I want to wait it out and see what is happening. But it's a project that is, that I think is my high point right now.
One more question. Who else had a question?
One small question.
Yes, Janice.
Just to pick up on what you said right at the end of the talk, which was so fantastic, by the way, really made me when he was speaking of how some of these questions of who we are and how we sort of travel to find who we are eventually, or whether we have to claim who we are in the place that we are at. And you said something very interesting. You said these are very important spiritual questions for me, and very important academic questions for me. And I was just wondering where these two might align or might converge. The spiritual, the academic, have they in some ways always moved in parallel through your life as a teacher, as a professor? Have they converged more strongly now? What has that journey?
I think that question, Janice, and also the one that Sumana asked and I forgot to answer, about uneasy.
Yes.
Why uneasy translations? I think that is the uneasy part of it. It is to actually think, where does the spiritual become political It is to ask, can questions of life be separate from questions of academia? It is to actually constantly think, what is this uneasy translation between these various discourses? So I think it is all of that, Janice, but have they become, if they've not become closer, I think I am becoming more confident of using the word spiritual in a way that you would have caught me do it 5 years ago. I think I'm now, I think I would have said more brazenly about sexuality than I would have said about spirituality. And I think I feel confident now to say it. I think we have for long not actually understood we have not understood what that particular realm does. And I think, like, for instance, even Shah Abdul Latif, Janice, is a figure, like in Pakistan, okay, this is being recorded, never mind. Like in Pakistan, when the Sindhis want to say F off to Pakistan establishment, they use Shah Abdul Latif. He's that kind of an iconic political figure. When their children betray them, they quote Shah Abdul Latif. When the cattle die, they quote Shah Abdul Latif. When the plants don't grow, they quote Shah Abdul Latif. So Shah Abdul Latif is both the spiritual and the political and all. So what are these separations, David? It's English language that is making us do these separations. Like I wrote a chapter recently where I'm noticing, in all the originals that I was noticing in Gujarati, Hindi, Sindhi, and also one in Bangla where I took Aruma's help, where people want to say, we would have thought they would say dharm, but they are actually saying zat. Right? And I thought, why are they doing it? Then I realized the separation of caste and religion, English language makes us do it. Really speaking, the word zat actually subsumes both. So I think it is also that. I think it is, I think I'm not accepting the habits of the English language, but that I've never.
I think academia's inability to be a habitat of a word and category such as the spiritual as well. And I think it comes from Anglophone academia in particular, maybe not so much in other languages. Thank you to all of you. I'm sure Rita and I will continue to have these conversations about elsewhere, and some of you will join us there. Thank you, Rita.
Thank you so much.